is Katja Franko. I'm Professor of Criminology at the University of Oslo. And this is...
And hello, I'm Alpa Parmar. I'm from the University of Oxford, and Katja and I are here for the Border Criminologies 5th anniversary conference.
Well, Alpa, I would like to start our conversation to talk about sort of developing alternative concepts, notions that might be useful for our future research on borders and criminology. You have written yourself, and others have pointed out, that policing of borders is basically policing of boundaries of belonging. Mm-hmm. And these boundaries have in recent years become increasingly narrow and fixed. So I would like to sort of invite you to reflect on how a more humane and just society, how should we think about belonging and membership?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, a challenging one, I think. And I think what the question that you've raised brings to my mind is about how malleable actually the notion of belonging is. So although, like you said, there is certain fixedness to things like ideas of somatic difference as marking out who belongs and who doesn't, I think that there are ways in which that's changed over time and across geography, and I think the policing, the way in which we respond to people who seem to belong or don't quite belong, kind of tells us something about those categories and how they shift. In terms of new concepts, I don't know about new concepts, but I think that thinking historically is perhaps important. So I think that often we see the current state of things as exceptional or extreme, i.e. that we're targeting British Muslims or black groups, but actually I think that it's interesting to think about those issues relationally. I think
that's actually a very important point, and because the importance of sort of historic awareness, and especially when it comes to issues of race that you have been working on a lot. You have written yourself that race is often not a topic which is very, very well addressed within studies of immigration policing. And what I'm wondering is whether this is perhaps because of a certain focus on the present within, not just within criminology, but I think social sciences in general have a tendency to focus on the exceptional, what is new, see things as new development, whereas the work that you have been doing and the work of others have pointed out that sort of immigration policing has a long racial history. So I'm just wondering whether, in a sense, greater awareness of history would bring also a greater awareness of race issues, and also a sort of awareness of the critical work that criminologists have been doing in the past on these kinds of issues to sort of integrate it better with issues of policing and migration and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the tasks of research on borders from my lens has been to reconnect almost race and migration. So British sociology started off with looking at race and migration as two sides of the same coin, and somehow that became bifurcated. And I think that it's an interesting project to think about why that separation happened, and also what new things we learned. But you're absolutely right. So when I'm talking or teaching about policing and policing borders, I always look back to the research on police culture in the 1970s and 80s, which actually tells us that the police have always been involved in managing migration. And some of the older work by Paul Gordon, who was writing in 1985, he really shows us that minority ethnic communities would maybe report being victims of crime, but then be asked about proving their citizenship, so they would be asked to produce their passports. And so I think that kind of fluidity has always existed. So I think you're absolutely right that looking at those older pieces of research and seeing how they're relevant today is really quite key. And I always say that it's really worrying, not so much how much has changed, but actually thinking about how much has stayed the same.
I'm just also wondering whether awareness of sort of older critical perspectives might sort of equip us better to critically address the question of immigrant criminality, how the sort of awareness of how criminality is constructed, comes about within the system and so on, that might also be a valuable perspective, which has a long sort of history within critical criminology. So yes.
Yeah, and we might look to cultural criminologists. Like I always think of work by Stuart Hall, for example. So they started with the work of policing and the moral panics around mugging, and that was interesting because it was at a time when migration was quite high in the UK, and thinking about how those narratives fit together.
Well, for me, working in Norway, I think perhaps this kind of perspective is even more distant in terms of sort of being aware of the racial aspects of immigration policing, because Scandinavian society in general, I think, see themselves often as sort of mono-ethnic societies, even though they never were.
Yeah, I'm really interested by that, and I wondered what your thoughts are on whether the policing of borders in Norway, has that brought to the fore more questions about race and who belongs and who doesn't in Norwegian society?
I think it has. I mean, and there has been a fair amount of critique. Also, interestingly, within the police organization itself, that they have to some extent resisted sort of being imposed really politically the task of doing immigration policing. And several voices, important voices within the police have said that this is sort of damaging for their relations with minority communities. At the same time, as I think that because Norway doesn't have a long history, colonial history and so on, that there is a lack of language in terms of that. I think one aspect that has been sort of brought forth in the empirical research that we have been doing is the question that police officers themselves sometimes compare this to the Second World War and the fate of the Jewish community in Norway. So there is a debate, but I think there's also room for improvement.